This is Focal Point with Brian Fisher on AFR Talk.
Listen to the audio podcast or download today's program at afr.net. You can also read Brian Fisher's columns at onenewsnow.com. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email us anytime at focalpoint@afr.net. Focalpoint@afr.net.
Hi, and welcome back to Focal Point on AFR Talk. Brian Fisher is my name. You are listening to Focal Point, the home of muscular Christianity on Conservative Talk Radio. I am your congenial, convivial, and amiable host, talking here in this first hour about the victory of incumbent Senator Thad Cochran over the challenger Chris McDaniel in the Republican primary yesterday, and getting ready to bring on a special guest to kind of review this and help us assess what happened last night. Here is an excerpt from Breitbart to set up my conversation with Rickey Cole. There were 24,889 votes cast in Hinds County. This is a largely African-American county near Jackson, Mississippi, the capital. 24,889 votes were cast in Hinds County in the runoff, 17,927 for Cochran, 6,962 were for McDaniel. So that is a margin of about 11,000 votes. In Hinds County alone, 11,000 votes going to Senator McDaniel. Remember, the margin of victory here was about 6,400 votes. But catch this, there were only 20,567 Republican voters in Hinds County. So you have 25,000 votes cast, but only 20,000 Republican voters if every single one of them turned out. And Republicans only voted in a primary, there'd be 20,000 votes cast. Instead, 25,000 votes. Extraordinarily high turnout in Hinds County is much more than what happened in Hinds County in the primary, where 16,640 total votes were cast, and 10,928 for Cochran, 5,621 for McDaniel. So McDaniel lost some votes in the runoff, went from 7,000 down to about 5,600, whereas Cochran jumped from about 10,900 to over 17,000, almost 18,000, jumped up by 8,000 votes. So very clearly, turnout in Hinds County had a huge impact on the outcome, Democrats showing up to vote. And with us to help kind of break that down is, I'm honored to welcome to our decision maker line Rickey Cole. And Mr. Cole is the chairman of the Democratic Party in the state of Mississippi. Welcome, Mr. Cole, to Focal Point with Brian Fisher.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate the opportunity to be on the air with you.
Well, it's great to have you on. And one of the reasons I wanted to chat with you, Mr. Cole, I'm looking at a piece on Breitbart where they interviewed you after this election, and you made it fairly clear to Breitbart, at least, that you were not particularly happy with this effort to get Democrats to cross over and vote for Senator Cochran. Is that accurate? And tell us why.
Well, to me, it's a matter of honor. I believe that people who identify with a particular political party ought to vote in their own party's primary, and they ought to leave the other party to make their own decision about who their nominee is. In simple terms, I believe Democrats ought to vote in the Democratic primary, and Republicans ought to vote in the Republican primary.
Now, right now, as you say, it's a matter of honor. That's a poignant choice of phrase. It's a matter of honor because there's nothing legally to stop somebody from crossing over. And this is a little bit off topic, but is there a way that that problem could be addressed? Is there a way that some policy could be established that would be enforceable that would reserve Republican primaries for Republican voters and Democrat primaries for Democratic voters?
Well, we have a state law that's already on the books, but it doesn't have any enforcement mechanism. I think the primaries were created for our parties to choose nominees, so we're going to be conferring with some of the legal experts. I'm not a lawyer myself, but we're going to be conferring with some of the legal experts about some potential changes to that process to maintain the integrity of the intent of a primary.
And it seems like this Mississippi law that you're referring to, it seems it was created for situations like this to prevent this kind of crossover voting, because the Mississippi law says, look, if you're going to participate in a primary, you can cross over and vote in another primary, but you have to commit yourself that you're going to support the candidate that wins that primary. In other words, the intent of that law was to prevent people from voting in one party's primary in the spring, knowing at the very same time they were going to vote for their own party's candidate when it came to November. So that would indicate that there would be, as you mentioned, Mr. Cole, minimum some dishonor involved in this kind of crossover voting. And maybe even worse, it seemed like there would be some illegality in casting a vote like that.
I'm not a lawyer. I can't speak to the illegality. But I will tell you that the reason the taxpayers of the state of Mississippi pay for primary elections is because the two-party system calls for each party to choose its own nominee. And for me, it's a matter of honor. I'd never vote in a Republican primary, and I never encourage any Democrat to vote in a Republican primary, and I'd want the same respect from them for ours. But it's a simple matter of honor and integrity, in my opinion.
Now, there's been I read quite a bit of debate leading up to the runoff about this prospect that there would be some crossover voting, and a bit of it, frankly, was a little bit mysterious to me, Mr. Cole. Maybe you can clear this up, talking with some friends of mine, because my understanding from what I read from Democrats is that the Democrats believed that Senator McDaniel would be easier to defeat in November than Senator Cochran. So it didn't make much sense to us that Democrats would be actively working to get the guy to win the Republican primary that they thought they were going to have a harder time beating in November. What's your reaction to that?
Well, these armchair pundits are always going to give you reasons for whatever they want to see happen. But I can make a case for the relative strengths or weaknesses of either of these candidates. I can tell you quite frankly, we were not looking forward to having to face the enthusiasm of the McDaniel supporters, because it's a tremendous enthusiasm out there behind his candidacy that was totally lacking on the side of the Cochran campaign. So the enthusiasm gap was in McDaniel's favor from day one all the way up until yesterday. I think there was a fear factor that caused a lot of Democrats to vote against McDaniel. They weren't necessarily voting for Cochran. They were voting against McDaniel because they were afraid of his socially conservative positions, or many of them were afraid for their own jobs. Teachers were pushed by administrators, even the state superintendent, to vote in the Republican primary to save Senator Cochran, because the implication was they'd lose their jobs. People at the shipyard down on the coast, their labor union leaders pushed for Senator Cochran because they were told you may lose your job if this other guy gets elected. Fear is a powerful motivator. And I think the traditionally Democratic voters who voted in the Republican primary did so because they were afraid. And I don't like the notion of generating fear in order to win an election. I don't like people going into an election and voting against somebody. You ought to be able to go vote for somebody you believe in.
Talking here with Rickey Cole, the chairman of the Democratic Party in the state of Mississippi. And what I hear you say, Mr. Cole, is that you were aware that running against Senator McDaniel would have some challenges because of the energy and the enthusiasm behind his backers that you did not see in the Cochran campaign. But what I hear you saying is a matter of honor, that you would prefer to take on the challenger who is the honest winner of a primary rather than to take on a guy where there's some question about the results of the primary.
I've been in politics all my life. I'll be 48 years old in August. And any time the integrity of the process is brought into question, it's not good for those who care about democracy and citizenship. And it doesn't matter which party you belong to or what side of any issue you're on. If the process is brought into question, the last thing we need is more public cynicism about our processes. There's too much of it now, and some of it is well-deserved. But we ought to conduct these elections and these processes through government with integrity and honor so that the people can be proud of the people they vote for and proud of the government that serves them.
One last question to ask Mr. Cole here. I'm quoting from the Breitbart news piece. You said this: clearly there was some sloppiness, to say the least, and probably some failures to comply with the law. You said this: in a race this close, I'm sure there are irregularities that ought to be looked into. I think the candidate owes it to his supporters to make sure that everything was done on the up and up. So you appear to be encouraging Senator McDaniel to possibly even challenge the election results here.
If this were a Democratic primary, I'd feel the same way, because there are thousands, tens of thousands of people who pinned their hopes on Senator McDaniel's candidacy. He would be letting them down if he didn't make sure that every question that was raised was answered to his satisfaction, in my opinion.
And one of the irregularities, possible irregularities you refer to, is those that may possibly have voted in the Democratic primary in June 3, but legally are not allowed to vote in the Republican runoff on June 24, but might have slipped through the net either intentionally or unintentionally.
Yeah, I've seen that happen in a lot of runoffs, particularly if there's a big crowd of voters coming in. The poll workers may overlook that person's name on the list of people who'd already voted in the primary. That's a common problem with these runoff elections. It's one of the reasons I really don't like our state runoff law.
Well, and I came from Idaho, where we labored for years to get a closed primary. And what we had to fight, Mr. Cole, in Idaho, we had to fight the Republican Party establishment. Mm-hmm. The grassroots Republicans wanted a closed primary. The Republican Party establishment wanted an open primary because it gave them an opportunity, and I think it's kind of what we saw yesterday, maybe, it gave them an opportunity to kind of sabotage the more conservative of the two Republican candidates, because they knew if they have an open primary and members of the other party are invited, allowed, encouraged to come over and vote, they're much more likely to vote for the more liberal of the two candidates. And so it became another tool for them to use to prevent conservatives from getting Republican nominees. Any reaction to that?
Well, in the Bible where it talks about separating the sheep from the goats, I believe we ought to separate the elephants from the donkeys at primary time and then let everybody come in and vote in November. I would love to see a system whereby this kind of crossover voting would not emerge as a problem as it has in this election, and I've seen it in other elections too from the other direction.
Our guest has been Rickey Cole, who's the chairman of the Democratic Party in the state of Mississippi. Mr. Cole, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you taking time to come on and kind of review with us what happened yesterday. I certainly agree with you about the importance of honor and integrity in the electoral process. I agree with your sentiments with regard to primaries, and I really appreciate you taking time to chat with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very kindly. I'll be at your disposal at any time. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Rickey Cole, chairman of the Democratic Party in the state of Mississippi, not happy with an open primary, thinks it's a mistake, thinks it's bad for both parties. He believes we ought to separate the sheep from the goats. At primary time, we ought to separate the elephants from the donkeys. Elephants vote in the elephant primary, donkeys vote in the donkey primary. I could not agree with this Democratic leader any more than I do. Back in 2.